and welcome everyone to This is Recruiting, a series focused on helping tech recruiters and HR professionals around the world to find actionable insight and tips from the fellow recruiting community. I hope all of you are staying safe and taking care of yourself. I'm your host, Sachin Gupta, the founder of HackerEarth. And at HackerEarth, our vision is to match developers to the right opportunities all across the globe through accurate coding assessments, remote interviews, and virtual hackathons. For today, we have with us Troy McIntosh, who's a diversity and inclusion leader at US Cellular. He's been a leader in the recruiting industry for over 2 decades now and has worked across a myriad of industries. Welcome, Troy. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you very much.
So, Troy, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your role is at US Cellular?
Thank you. So I've been at US Cellular for about almost 5 years now. I lead our diversity and inclusion practice, which for us, that includes inclusion, so the cultural components of inclusion, diverse talent, so we get involved with helping the organization to identify, retain, and promote diverse talent. Compliance, we have in the U.S. we have a number of things that we're required to report on to the federal government with respect to compliance. Supplier diversity as well, which is how US Cellular spends and ensuring we spend more money with small and diverse businesses. And lastly, our resource groups, which we have 8 resource groups that focus on different types of diversity: women, people of color. We have an Asian group, African American led group, Latinx, people with disabilities, pride, sexual orientation group as well. So my team leads all those functions.
That's a pretty large charter. You know, you're not just focusing on people, but you're also focusing on the supply groups and a couple of other, verticals. So that's interesting. So did this kind of exist before you came in, or is this something that you've set up over the last few years?
Yeah. So US Cellular has been involved with diversity and inclusion work for about the past 20 years. I did spend some time working on a strategy. Part of my role was was maybe clarifying some of the work that we were doing, but much of this work we were already doing. We did sort of restart our supplier diversity work in the past 3 years or so. So that work got kind of a recharge, and we've got great leaders in the area of talent and inclusion. And I would say we've sort of increased our focus in how to recruit diverse talent and how to promote that diverse talent in the company.
Great. So, talking a little bit about diversity and inclusion from a talent perspective, and I'm sure this is a dilemma that a lot of recruiters and hiring teams face. When you're evaluating candidates, you get a diverse candidate who's probably, as good as, they're pretty good, but then, sometimes you also find a candidate who appears to be a superstar and may not be a diverse candidate. Of course, obviously we have to keep in mind that this is, at the end of the day, interviews are a little bit subjective. So the evaluation of the other person is also a little bit subjective. So how do you kind of take decisions in those instances at those moments? How do you decide would you rather go with a diverse candidate, or would you go with the best candidate for the job at that point in time?
Right. I would say that my team doesn't, my team at this point doesn't really get involved requisition to requisition like that. My team is more focused on ensuring diverse candidates are in the pipeline, that they're in the interview process, and that the interview process is free of bias. So we would be more involved with training leaders on reflecting on their own biases, involved with ensuring that the pipeline and that the interview slate is diverse. And at US Cellular, things, maybe a little bit different than most companies. I don't know. I talked to my colleagues about this quite a bit, but we don't see much disparity between our applicant pool diversity and our hire diversity. So we spent a lot of time with leaders encouraging them to build a team, right? A talented, diverse team. A couple of years ago, we actually brought some thinkers in. We brought this person, his name is Scott Page, in to talk about diversity and team composition. And so we've taken the stance that the diverse team will outperform the less diverse team. So rather than hire 5 people that are really similar, the diverse team will actually outperform. So if you view the focus of the company as being ensuring you have different thinking on teams, right, versus thinking of that strategy has worked really well for us. And I wouldn't say that we really have that concern that often. Typically, We have a very robust talent pipeline, and we found, right, I'm crossing my finger, we found that our leaders tend to hire in a pretty equitable way when they have diversity in the interview slate. Now, I would say at some companies that's not the case. I actually work with other companies where they see a decrease of success. Right. At US Cellular, we actually haven't had that problem.
That's interesting. That's super interesting. So you touched upon a couple of things. You spoke about ensuring that the pipeline itself is diverse, then ensuring that there is no bias in the interviewing process. So could you talk about some of the key metrics that you measure at your level to kind of make sure that your diversity and inclusion program is working as expected?
Right. So we've actually built some targets. We built targets, and those targets are based on equity, right? So the way I would explain it is, I like to tell my daughter that she has an equal chance of becoming CEO at the company than I would. So what we want to see is internal equity. As an example, if 50% of our individual contributors in sales are women, we'd like to see 50% of managers, 50% of directors, and we spend our time trying to figure out, if that's not the case, why is that, right? So we track it with targets, and I would say the targets, we do want to meet the targets, but I think a better way of explaining it is that the targets inform our choices. If we see, right, for example, that fewer women are being promoted, we want to know why. Right. And then we talk to leaders about why. Is it that they're not interviewing? Is it that women have less confidence? Is it that men don't view them as being as talented? Whatever the reason is, my team gets involved with exploring why and trying to remedy that issue. So yeah, we use the actual hire rates, who gets hired. We look at applicants. We look at interview diversity, once again, to make sure there's diversity in interview. We look at our pipelines, right? So when we, our functions that have succession processes, we look at who's in those pipelines and how diverse they are. And we look at our attrition, who's leaving the company. So it's really a function of all those things and trying to figure out what's going on in terms of equity.
Got it. So it looks like you're looking at a bunch of very relevant metrics, which are actually across the life cycle of an employee, not just at the top of the funnel, but also once they're in the system, how they're progressing, and eventually who's leaving and who's staying behind. So that's great. So from talking a little bit about, like you spoke about ensuring there is no bias at the interviewing stage. So could you talk about some of the trainings or processes that you put in place for your managers and hiring managers in order to reduce the bias during the interview and hiring process?
Right. So these aren't, they're not secret processes. They're research-based. I mean, it's very clear how you reduce the bias. So one thing we do is that we train our leaders on their biases. So as a matter of fact, last week we just had an event. We called it an inclusion summit. We brought in seven speakers to train the entire organization. We had a session that was on bias in the hiring process. Brought in an expert, amazing expert, Dr. Stephanie Johnson from Colorado. Great research. So that's just top of the line education for our leaders to understand how these hiring decisions get made. That's one thing. The other thing that we do is we actually regularly review what actually happens and do some auditing. Nextly, we use a behavioral interviewing process. So we make sure that we use that consistent behavioral interviewing process. And the last thing I'd say, which is really important, is we're actually, there's two more things. We encourage the use of diverse interview teams, right? We find that when there's diversity in the interview team, just, when people know they're being observed, they actually become less biased, right? When they know their decision is being watched. So there's great research about this. So, and then the last thing is that we use a technology called Textio that actually decreases bias in the job description. So we scrub our job descriptions, and Textio it's an augmented writing tool. It actually uses AI. There's sort of a system that looks at the hit rates of of job descriptions, right? So for example, if you use certain words, how frequently do men resonate? Did those words resonate with men versus women? So we use that AI platform, and we update our job descriptions on a regular basis to make sure that we get more women coming into the pipeline. So those are just some of the things that we use.
Got it. Got it. So, talking a little bit, like unpacking that a little bit, the biases are often deeply ingrained in people, right? And sometimes people don't even know it's like really at a subconscious level. So inclusivity is not something that, can just be forced upon on people.
No.
So how have you been able to, or your team has been able to transform that thought process within the leadership team when it comes to inclusivity and breaking those barriers?
That's a really good question. So there's a few things. So one thing we do is that we have put our senior leaders, all of our directors and above, through an assessment called the IDI, and that stands for Intercultural Development Inventory. It's actually a global assessment that gets used in many countries, and it focuses on cultural competence. Cultural competence is your ability to identify and recognize cultural difference and then bridge that difference, right? So we find that most leaders in corporate America struggle with thinking about culture in a multicultural way. They have a very monocultural way. They view things through their own cultural frame. So through this assessment, we actually put our directors and above through it, and they get a score, they get assessed against their team, they get feedback, they get encouraged to develop a development plan. So we actually provide assessments for our leaders to be able to understand how to get better at bridging cultural difference. That's one thing. Second thing is that we have a leadership competency on inclusion. We've actually been coaching and training people for the past 2 years or so. We have a person, so I'm really excited. I mean, I have a person on my team. Her name is Dr. Salwa Rahim Dillard. She just finished her PhD, she's an expert in the area of inclusion. So she's built out behavioral anchors on inclusion. And so we've been training our leaders on inclusion, what it looks like very precisely for the past 2 years. That's included, we've done fun events, we've involved our research groups, we've given them training. We actually ran a video last year called Inclusion is How We Do Things at the organization. So we've done a combination of marketing and development. And then we've taken that inclusion and competency, and it's part of our leadership competency. So leaders get rated against that, right? So over time, if they struggle in that area, they would get feedback. And then the last thing I will say sounds very basic, but it's a part of our selection process, right? Because after saying all that, which I think that we do great work in developing people, I do think you have to identify and hire people that are inclusive. Right. So it's a question that we ask when we hire people. A part of the behavioral interview process is asking them, give us an example of when you developed or led people that weren't like you. Right. I mean, that's a pretty basic question. Right. But to have leaders think through their experiences as bridging difference as a part of, getting hired in the first place is a really core part of what we do.
Got it. So it's not just about, training and assessing people, but it's also about bringing the right people, at the top of the funnel.
Oh, I say talent acquisition is obviously where you get the highest results, right? Because it's a lot easier to just hire somebody that's in alignment with your values versus trying to train it. So yeah, absolutely. That's definitely key.
Got it. So, this is something that, so the next particular question, I've put that across to multiple people and I kind of find different responses. So there's one school of thought that says, if you really want to tackle diversity and inclusion, then you've got to have targets in terms of if my, let's take gender. So if my gender ratio is today, say 70-30 or 80-20, it has to go to 60-40 or whatever that number is. So you're putting a target or saying my team has to be at least that much diverse. While there's another school of thought that says diversity and inclusion is not about achieving that number, but it's about ensuring the process is kind of fair, and then whoever gets through the process, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to hire the right person for the job. In which school of thought do you lie, and what's your take on this?
Right. So I would say, I'll answer this question in two ways. I would say both, but I would lean toward the first school of thought. I'm not sure I would say that they're different. I do agree that the process needs to be fair, because if it's not fair, it will not become equitable. But I will tell you, with our senior leadership team, when we started this work looking at our talent, we started it in 2017. And we had a fairly robust debate with our senior leaders about those two words. Should we focus on fairness or equity? Right? And it was a very theoretical conversation, right. But we had the debate, right? Which one is it? Is it that we just want to have a fair process and let the results follow where they may? Or do we want to lean toward equity? And we came to the agreement that as an organization, while every organization doesn't achieve, we want to think about equity as one of our values. So when we talk about equity, we're interested in not only was the process fair, but what are the results, right? And there are a lot of things that we use to assess that. So one of the things is we use measures that are very, very fair, for lack of a better term, because we use, in the US, you have these affirmative action plans. Affirmative action plans give you zip code by zip code information about the talent marketplace. So we don't set targets that go beyond who's already in the talent marketplace, and then we look internally. So once again, my question is, if we know 50% of our individual contributors are women, why are our managers reflecting that? So we try to focus on being curious, inquisitive, challenging ourselves, right? Pushing the envelope further. We do use targets because people want to know, like, what does good look like? And we say it's like having a more equitable environment. And typically when leaders see, like, we use these charts, we have a great online system where we track it, but we use these pyramid charts. Typically when leaders see, women or African Americans or Asians decreasing, typically most leaders go, I don't feel very proud about that. Like, most leaders feel, so we spend a lot of time bringing them back to the data, asking why. And, from a values perspective, I think our company is aligned, if your company is aligned with the value of equity or diversity and inclusion, for us, that's been very helpful, simply showing them the data. And most leaders feel embarrassed when they see, why can't we develop more women directors? Like, most of them feel that way, right? So there's an internal pressure, right, to ensure that we're doing the right thing.
Right. That's I think that's a very valid approach. Unless you put certain targets and you kind of measure them proactively, things will not change, right? Like, to your point, while we should have a fair process, but then also at the end of the day, it also has to result in some tangible metrics. So the next point is, the next question that I have is, how do you when you have people coming into this, so if you look at roles like technology, and we talk about women in tech, right? All said and done, the pipeline itself is skewed, right? I'm not sure what's the case at US Cellular, but we've spoken with multiple organizations and they often say, hey, we don't get enough women candidates. So if there's no top of the funnel, then how do we ensure that at the end of the day, we are hiring, let's say, 50-50 split? So what's your take on that? Is that a problem that the society needs to solve? Do we need to go, a few levels down and say, hey, let's get more women in tech? Or do you think it's just a way out for a lot of organizations today to say, hey, I can't do much about it?
Right. That's a really good question. So we do work closely with, organizations like Society of Women Engineers, right? And they're looking at that question, right? I mean, the underlying question you're asking is, should a company be concerned about, how many women are even interested in tech, right? Yep. And developing that from the ground up, or should the company say, maybe women don't want to get into these roles, and is it our role? So I think the answer is probably, I would lean more toward, that there are probably structural things about the way tech operates that make it hard. Like, I have a friend, I know this is anecdotal, but I have a friend of mine who was a CTO at a small, very good, I've been friends with him for years. is a CTO at a local company here in Chicago, and so he got his daughter involved with some programming activities, and he's a brilliant programmer. And she was doing this when she was, I don't know, I say she's 10 or 11, and she started to go back to the same group over the next year, and she said, "Daddy, I don't want to do this anymore." He said, "Why?" "Because I'm the only girl. I just don't want to do it." Right now, he was like, "What do I do? Do I make my kid? She's brilliant, right? Right. Do I make her do it, or do I accept the fact she doesn't want to do it when I know the reason she doesn't want to do it is because she is the only girl?" I mean, my feedback would be, hey, you don't want your kid to feel like you're abusing them, but can you do something like get them involved with a tech group that's, they're great groups like, I don't know, I See Stars in Chicago or SWE. Are there things you can do, to get her involved with other women programmers as well, so she doesn't feel out of place? So I think the answer for companies has to be a little bit of both. Like on the one hand, we have the issue. I mean, I just got off a call with some of our engineers. I mean, we have an issue at our company, which is pretty common with men and women. Actually, it's not just women in tech, but we have many people in tech that really, at our company, they love their current job, right? Like they got in engineering because they wanted to do something that was connected to a specific business problem. So they might not want to be a leader, right?
Right.
But we know from the data, if we can get more women in leadership, we can hire more women, right? So you find yourself saying, man, I don't want to pressure you to be a leader, but let me show you all the possibilities if you stick with it, right? So I think as an organization, we have the responsibility to try to tear down the structural things, right? Without forcing people into tech if they don't want to do it. But we are aware that there are, if you don't see women leading, if you don't see women if you grow up, you don't see women in the group, you're going to be less likely to want to do it because you just don't, so I think we have to do both, actually. That's a long answer, but yeah.
That makes so much sense. We're almost coming towards the end of the discussion, but the COVID-19 and this pandemic has changed a lot of things. People are not working at offices. And that's, in my opinion, and I may be wrong, but when it comes to diversity and inclusion and equity, that's a double-edged sword. Because yes, a lot of biases can accelerate when, you're at office seeing people who probably are different than you. And some of those things kind of get reduced when, you're talking over a call. But then also a lot of relationships are built face to face. A lot of those barriers are broken down when you're there in person. So how do you see things becoming more complicated for you as, we continue working from home?
That's a really good question. So I would say that we've only thought about it a little bit. I mean, the D&I team has started to get involved with, we're talking to a partner that does work on mindfulness, right? Like technology mindfulness, helping people to manage how they feel when they come to work and manage how to continue building some of those relationships. There's some really interesting work in, like distance. We're thinking about bringing somebody to come talk to the organization about distance bias. One of the interesting things about this is that, in a Zoom, or I'm not sure if Zoom does this, but at our company, we use Microsoft Teams. It's opened up another element of analysis, right? Where we can see people's networks more. We can see, right? We've kind of started to talk to IT about, how can we use this information we already know before we got to this situation that the way, for example, women network, right, is slightly different. And so we've been trying to figure out how do we encourage people to build, to your point, build networks. And I don't know that we as a company are open to like really, tracking this at the individual level, but at the functional level, it's a really good point because there's a lot more we can track now. We can track cross-functional interactions. We can track how frequently you meet with your team more easily. We can track, gender, like all of these things. We can actually turn them into data and track them with respect to inclusion. So we've done some really cool things, like our resource groups. We had a summit last week, and we found a lot of involvement, like almost like people crave to have the connection more than in the past, right? We did this. I mean, we had hundreds of people on these calls last week around diversity, and I was pleasantly surprised. But I think some of it was people just want to be together, right? And so to be able to see people visually has really helped. So I would say the jury's still out. We're still learning how it's going to affect us long term, but to your point, it has impacted us quite a bit. We've seen more uptick with people wanting to get together. The last thing I'll mention is that we definitely know we think it can help us from a talent perspective, because our company is we are in some markets that aren't that diverse. And as the company gets more comfortable, right, hiring people across other geographies, right, we think it's going to help us to be able to hire diverse talent, because all the talent doesn't have to live in close proximity to the office. So we're actually very excited about that. Okay. So yeah,
that's really good to know.
Yeah.
So as we come towards the end of the discussion, Troy, any actionable advice that you would want to give to our listeners who probably are early in their career and thinking about diversity and inclusion?
So I mean, from a recruiter perspective, I would just say, build your network. Like, I mean, as corny as it sounds, in recruiting, the diverse network wins. I can't tell you how many times that when I was a recruiter, like I've spent time in my career both being a recruiter and leading recruiters, and people typically tend to reflect their network, right? So if you want to find, if you want to find women or want to find Asians or Blacks or Latinos, you typically begin to look for those networks that are like that. And so I would say leverage your network and build your network in a cross-cultural way. I like some of the tools like the LinkedIn and some of the online search training that deals with diversity and recruiting. I would say lean into some of those things. But I would definitely say this piece around leveraging diversity. When I can't tell you how many times that I was hiring somebody and a diverse person on the interview team ruled the day, like save that hire. Like that person said, I wasn't sure about that company till I met that woman. And you know what? I wasn't sure until I met that African American, I met that person who looks kind of like me, and I got more confidence. So leverage your network and make sure that you leverage diverse interview teams so they can really help you to win when you get to the point of trying to close that hire.
That's a very relevant advice, Troy. So, well, that's all the time that we have today, and it brings us to the end of this episode of This is Recruiting. It was really great talking to you, Troy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
I sure have enjoyed speaking with you today, and I personally learned a lot. For all of you listening, if you've learned something new as well, please like and share this video to spread the word, and remember to share your opinions and learnings on the comments. Lastly, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube channel so that you're notified for the next video. See you soon. Thank you.